As everybody knows, the Amazon is under threat. Deforestation threatens ecosystems as trees fall to make way for cattle and soybeans. But this isn't the first time that the Amazon has been transformed in service of the global economy. Because in the middle of the 19th century, the world's largest rainforest was the center of one of the most ferocious commodity crazes in history. This video tells the story of the rubber boom. These videos tell stories of places and people as I try to find the echoes of the past in the world of the present. In the previous two videos, we've delved into the mystery of the Amazon before the arrival of the Europeans, and how year by year, archaeology is uncovering traces of long-lost cultures we never even knew existed. Then, when the Europeans connected the Americas to the global system, these cultures were decimated by cruelty, exploitation, and disease. But that is not the whole story, because to get from there to here, we need to examine how colonization worked and how the exploitation of the Amazon only really began in the era of industrialization. So let's begin. In 1616, the Portuguese founded Belém do Pará, near the mouth of the Amazon, as a military fort. 40 years later, it was still a tiny town of only 300 Europeans. Because of how much sediment gets washed in from the mighty river, its harbour was too shallow, and currents and winds generated by the vast flow of water isolated it from the rest of Brazil. It was faster to sail to Lisbon, almost 6,000 kilometers away, than to Rio, only 4,000 kilometers away. As a result, for 300 years, its population never had much more than 25,000 people, exporting a paltry amount of tobacco and a bit of sugar. Similarly, upriver, the Portuguese built forts at Manaus and Santarem, but these were always tiny settlements. By the mid-18th century, the Europeans had finally started to adapt to life in the Amazon. They had 135,000 head of cattle on the Marajó. They exported meat, hides, cotton, tobacco, and sugar, and millions of turtle eggs were destroyed each year, their oil sold for cooking or to light lamps. But Portugal's Amazon colony was still the poor relation of the sugar and coffee economy of the rest of Brazil, and large parts of Amazonia, away from the big rivers, were still unpenetrated by colonists. Slave raiding for natives still continued illegally, but at a lesser intensity, possibly because there weren't many people left within reach to enslave. Some native people started to move into the towns and formed a sort of proletariat, an underclass without education who were often forced to work in the very earliest stages of jungle urbanization. At a rough guess, there were 30 to 40,000 people living in Lower Amazonas at this point, and around 27,000 in Upper Amazonas. Added to that were still 100 to 200,000 uncontacted indigenous peoples in the vast stretches of forest that Europeans were yet to touch. The next phase in the history of the Amazon began when Napoleon invaded Iberia in 1807, and the Portuguese royal family decamped to Brazil. This was the first and almost the last time that any European monarch actually visited one of their overseas colonies. For the next 13 years, Rio de Janeiro became the capital of the Portuguese Empire, until 1822, when Pedro, heir to the Portuguese throne, proclaimed himself emperor of a new independent nation, the Empire of Brazil. But the Amazon remained a backwater, a region in economic decline, populated by detribalized native people who had been forcefully settled, and mixed-race riverfolk called Ribeirinhos. The settlers in the rainforest felt little connection to their rich countrymen far away in the southern cities. By now, the complexion of Amazonia had also changed. An entire new people had come into existence, caboclos, people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, a product of the centuries of mixing, much of it forced, between these two peoples. Though initially a pejorative word, it came to have a certain prestige. They were frontiersmen who had learned how to survive in the Amazon. Governors sent from Rio were incompetent and harsh. A revolt in 1831 had to be repressed. In 1832, soldiers in Manaus mutinied and proclaimed independence. But the big one came in 1835, and its echoes would be felt throughout the region for generations. It was called the Cabanagem, named after the Cabanos, the homeless migrants who formed an oppressed underclass and rose up in full-scale rebellion. The government declared martial law throughout the lower Amazon as soldiers hunted down the revolutionaries who had been joined by African and indigenous slaves, and it was brutal. Never having a unified goal or leader, the movement died a slow death, pushed into the remote forest. The Brazilian Amazon was shattered. Maybe a fifth of its population had been killed. Prince Adalbert of Prussia, who explored the Xingu a few years later, described the causes of the uprising. These disturbances were the fruits of the ceaseless oppression which the white population had, from the very first, exercised on the poor natives, and in no part of Brazil more than here. There was little to show for the first 250 years of European colonization of the Amazon. Diseases and cruelty had destroyed most of the indigenous nations that had flourished along the rivers. For all this, there was the town of Belém do Pará, a few stone forts, and the remnants of the mission villages. Between these small settlements were miles and miles of forests, infested with malaria, a disease the Europeans had brought with them to the New World. But now the outside world was at last taking an interest in the Amazon. One country that was sniffing around was the United States. Under pressure from, among others, the Americans, the Empire of Brazil made the Amazon the only river in the world open to international merchant shipping. It was proposed that Washington could transfer the entire southern plantation economy of slaves and slavers to the lower Amazon. It would become the biggest slave state of the United States, and as a safety valve, they could avoid tearing apart the Union over the issue of slavery. Their argument was that because ocean currents push the outflow of the Amazon up into the Caribbean where it meets the waters of the Mississippi, it was technically a part of North America, and so the US should annex it. Not enough plantation owners paid attention, but on losing the Civil War, some 10,000 Confederates fled to the Amazon. Thankfully, the colony was a complete failure, and all but a few hundred soon left. Those that stayed, however, formed a sort of satellite state of the Confederacy near Santarem. They would be a part of the scenery of the next act in the Amazon story, which would see the rainforest changed forever. Santarem, of course, is still around, even if there aren't many Confederate traces left, but it still contains some surprises, and might not be exactly what you're expecting a muddy rainforest town to look like.
Just upriver from Santarem is Alto do Chao. Brazil is very much a beach country, even in the Amazon, and you can get almost anything on a Brazilian beach, whether it is beer, cake, or popcorn. After several days of hard travel, for my friends Leticia and Dan and I, some beach relaxation was just what we needed. And we took a boat across the river to the more secluded beach on the far shore. Just down the river from Alto do Chao is Santarem. Though Santarem only has a population of some 60,000 people, it is the biggest city in the Amazon, between Belém on the coast and Manaus in the heart of the continent. Offshore, where the biggest boats are moored, you can see a massive grain terminal, built by American agribusiness giant Cargill. And from above you can see how the darker colours of the Tapajós meet the muddy Amazon. Walking around Santarem, it can be very easy to forget you're in the heart of the rainforest, but in the heart of the rainforest you very much are. Because the closest cities are well over 24 hours of travel away, for this part of the Amazon, Santarem qualifies as bustling. But fundamentally, what we found was a quaint and peaceful town with a boardwalk that, in the evening, is a wonderful place to stroll and watch the boats fish, and the people take the cool air coming off the world's biggest river. To me, it felt sort of timeless, like everyone meets here every evening and has been doing so since the dawn of time. To my eye, it's not a bad life at all. Meanwhile, in Alto do Chao, the last bathers linger in the warm jungle water as another rainforest day comes to an end. A beach town, Amazon style. Over 100 years on, you would scarcely guess that almost all of this came into being as a result of something so ghastly and so harrowing.
We left the story with the Amazon having little to show for centuries of attempted commercial exploitation. But by the 1850s, that was changing. The Amazon had its first resource that the world really wanted: rubber. Rubber comes from latex, a fluid collected through making an incision in the rubber tree. Rubber itself had been known about by Europeans since the time of Columbus, and had been used by the indigenous peoples for millennia for all sorts of things, such as syringes for inhaling hallucinogens. The problem was that it became sticky and smelly when hot, and hard and brittle when frozen, so its use was limited. What changed everything was the discovery, in 1839, of vulcanization. Vulcanization, named after Vulcan, the Roman god of fire, by Charles Goodyear, the guy who gave his name to the Goodyear Tire Company, is the process of adding sulfur to rubber, which makes it stable and durable. Vulcanization was the first element that created the rubber boom. The second was the Industrial Revolution. By the middle of the 19th century, it had really started to roar into life, and rubber was an essential component. Imagine any engine without the rubber pipes and valves that channel water, oil, and gasoline, and it was insulating wires with rubber that made widespread electrification possible. The world simply couldn't get enough rubber, and the Amazon had a monopoly. At last, it had its first truly profitable commodity. But it was just getting started. When the pneumatic rubber tire was invented in 1888, mass-produced bicycles became a craze. Then came the automobile. Demand seemed insatiable. Rubber became known as white gold. Between 1870 and 1910, even though supply increased tenfold, demand was such that the price of rubber still tripled. It was the rubber boom that made Manaus, which became the rubber capital of the world. Even though it is 1,500 kilometers from the ocean, it is a deep water port all year round and conveniently located near the mouths of the great rubber rivers. Ocean-going ships could cruise up the river to Manaus and sail back down to bring the rainforest's rubber to the world. In the 1860s, Manaus was still a 3,000-person settlement. By 1890, this had increased to 10,000. By 1900, it had reached 50,000. It was one of the first cities in Brazil to have electric lighting, telephones, a university, and tramways, with green American streetcars. The municipal market was designed by English architects, its floating dock by Scottish engineers. It had hospitals, a public library, a zoo, a racecourse, a bull ring, a botanical garden. Its paving stones were sent from Portugal. It was the world's largest market for diamonds. It had more movie theaters than Rio and more playhouses than Lisbon. And it was wild. There were dozens of nightclubs, bars, and brothels. Eduardo Gonçalves Ribeiro, the governor of Amazonas, died in a whorehouse. During an orgy, Manaus was the quintessential boomtown. Its crown jewel was the Teatro Amazonas, built from material from across the world. Ironwork from Glasgow, tiles from Alsace, marble and chandeliers from Italy. The roads around the opera house were apparently paved in rubber, so the clattering of late arrivals wouldn't interrupt the show. Manaus was called the Paris of the tropics, and it was built on a pyramid of exploitation. The thing with rubber is that, like many Amazonian trees, because of insects and disease, it likes to spread itself thinly, and it's because of these pests that in the Amazon it doesn't grow well in plantations. Therefore, in the forest, there are only a couple of tappable trees per hectare, so the industry relied on wild rubber tappers, the seringueiros. They were at the bottom of the food chain. Collecting rubber was grueling work. The day would start after midnight, when it was cool enough for the rubber to flow. Each night, he might walk 8 to 10 kilometers, tapping 100 to 200 trees a night. When the cups were full, he would head for the smokehouse. As one contemporary observer wrote, "At the end of the day, it is not difficult to realize the state of the seringueiro, for he will be found after he has finished smoking his day's collection of latex, with tired, sore eyes, sunken and smarting from the effects of the smoke, his body racked with spasmodic coughing and covered with smoke, dirt, and soot." Malaria killed the seringueiros, but also beriberi, Chagas disease, botflies, intestinal parasites, and snake bites as well. Each of Manaus's trading houses controlled a concession of Amazon forest. Each seringueiro brought everything they needed from the boss's store on credit at steep prices and weren't allowed to shop anywhere else. They were forbidden from fishing and hunting. They ate what was sold to them by the occasional traders, which was often rotting. The boss would charge a 50% commission to bring the rubber to Manaus, and he could punish them with beatings and whippings for any transgression. Wives and daughters could be abducted to settle unpaid loans. As legendary Brazilian sociologist Euclides da Cunha put it, the Amazonian rubber trade was the most criminal employment organization ever spawned. But the existing population of Amazonia was never going to be enough to meet demand, and it would be laborers fleeing drought in Brazil's northeast that would meet it. This had historically been sugar and cattle country, but the drought had baked the land and killed as many as 500,000 people. Many of these starving and neglected backlanders fled into the Amazon, helped by the government, hoping to make a new life in the rubber trade. Some 25,000 rubber estates sprung up throughout the rainforest, and many of the people who arrived owing money to the people that brought them would never leave debt for the rest of their lives. In the century to 1900, the population of the lower Amazon increased tenfold, living in small, isolated clusters of huts along the rivers or in the sprawling shanty towns around Manaus or Belém. The rubber boom was a disaster for the indigenous peoples of the Amazon. Entire groups like the Apiaca were practically wiped out. Rubber bosses kept harems of native women. Still more native people escaped deeper into the forest. The best rubber trees grew in Bolivia. Rubber barons gained concessions that operated every bit like sovereign countries. For many indigenous peoples, the rubber barons were their first encounters with the outside world. The rubber barons ruled them with an iron fist. On the Madeira River, Nicolas Suarez had 10,000 employees on his payroll, controlling 8 million hectares of rubber forests. In addition, he owned ranches with 250,000 head of cattle. He was known as the Rockefeller of rubber. Together, he and his cousin controlled an area of northern Bolivia half the size of France. One friend of his on the Madre de Dios River rounded up 600 Indian girls and invited his mates to impregnate them so that their children would grow up to be his slaves. The Suarez brothers amputated limbs for unmet quotas. It was an economy of atrocity. The worst of these rubber barons might have been the Peruvian Julio Cesar Arana, who controlled more than 22,000 square miles in the Putumayo region of Peru, near the juncture where Colombia, Brazil, and Peru meet. By 1902, he controlled 5 entire indigenous nations. Boys and girls as young as 6 or 7 were forced to carry rubber balls heavier than themselves. Child soldiers were used to round up laborers. Slaves were held in chains. Floggings were known as Arana's mark. Wives were raped in front of their husbands, and 6-year-olds beheaded in front of their mothers. Chris Feliciano Arnold writes how one station master flogged a woman's back into strips of flesh, then poured vinegar and salt in her wounds. Station directors doused disobedient workers with kerosene and set them ablaze, delighting in their screams. Those who dared to flee were hunted down and tortured in front of their kin, witnesses to the wrath of Arana. Arana himself moved to Manaus, where he had a reputation for quiet decency, while his underlings expanded his realm, bribing government officials and killing competitors. In 1907, he listed his Peruvian Amazon Rubber Company on the London Stock Exchange, attracting more than £1 million in investment. It had a respectable board of British directors who believed Arana's lies about having legal title to the rubber land and how he used company profits to educate tens of thousands of his native employees. No outsider was allowed into Arana's territory, and a security apparatus cruised the rivers. But in 1907, two American travelers who had heard rumors of what was going on while exploring nearby decided to try. They were caught, beaten, and arrested by Irana's private police force, but just managed to get out alive. It would be Irana's listing on the London Stock Exchange that would get him. When the stories of the Americans were published in the British press, there was public outrage and a parliamentary inquiry. They sent an investigator named Roger Casement in 1909 to find out what was going on. Casement had built his reputation exposing atrocities in the Congo by agents of Belgium's King Leopold II, and he confirmed the worst accusations of the Americans. He coined a new phrase: crimes against humanity. His report sparked worldwide outrage and earned him a knighthood. Irana's empire disintegrated, though many of the most terrible monsters he employed fled across the frontier. He would die penniless in 1952. There's more to the story of how rubber shaped the Amazon. While the Treaty of Madrid in 1750 had sorted out the borders of Brazil and its neighbours, there was one more adjustment still to come. Some of the best rubber forests were in Acre, a territory in Bolivia, around the headwaters of the Juruá and Purus rivers. As the rubber boom started to roar along, thousands of Brazilian seringueiros flooded into the area. By 1890, there were 120,000 rubber men in the Purus Valley. By 1900, Acre was responsible for 60% of all of Amazonia's rubber. The Bolivians realized that much of it was escaping untaxed into Brazil because it was easier to sail up the rivers from Brazil than to move overland and up over the Andes. Bolivia tried to impose an export duty on the rubber, so in 1899 a Brazilian rubber boss led a gang of men to attack Puerto Alfonso, tearing down the Bolivian flag and sending Bolivian officials upriver, declaring the independent state of Acre with its own constitution. Neither Brazil nor Bolivia liked the establishment of this rubber-rich jungle republic. Brazil sent an infantry battalion to suppress their own seringueiros in Acre and then didn't withdraw. The Bolivians couldn't do anything about it. In the Treaty of Petrópolis in late 1903, Brazil traded 191,000 square kilometre territory of Acre for 5,000 square kilometres of Brazilian land near the Madeira, plus £2 million. And with that, Brazil was complete with its current borders, just in time for the complete collapse of the Amazon rubber boom. You see, in 1876, a British adventurer named Henry Wickham had smuggled out 70,000 rubber tree seeds to the Royal Botanic Gardens in London. It took a few decades of breeding, but these seeds were eventually used to start rubber plantations in British Malaya and Dutch Sumatra. Unlike in the Amazon, there were no natural predators of the rubber tree in Asia, so the trees could be planted close together. Labourers scattered through a continent-sized forest were no match for the efficiency of workers moving down rows of closely packed trees. By 1912, these plantations had come online, producing 8,500 tons of latex, around a quarter of the total of the Amazon. By 1923, they were producing 370,000 tons. Brazil's rubber monopoly was over. Wickham received a knighthood. So rubber production in the Amazon would return to a cottage industry once again, until an odd addendum to the story, involving the world's most famous industrialist and a little American Midwestern city in the middle of the jungle. The next video is about Henry Ford and his quest to save the Amazon.